Hello and welcome to the third lecture in the GeoCurrents lecture series on global population. Today I'm going to look at the deep history of human population, essentially from the origin of humankind to the development of agriculture some 10,000 years ago. Before I begin, it's important to state that a lot of the material here is quite uncertain and quite speculative, and I'll be talking about that as I go along. When I prepare these lectures, I look for charts, graphs, etc. From the internet that can illustrate some of these patterns. For example, I searched for graphs on world population. I wasn't too impressed with what I found, but of course it's almost impossible to do this sort of thing. But here's just a typical one, just going back 10,000 years. It's not very useful because you basically see a flat line, and then you see population starting to grow not all that long ago with a couple of jumps. I'm not sure what they mean or why they're there. But the point of this slide really is to note that the flat line that you see is an artifact of scale because global population has increased so much in the last 100, 200 years that it's almost impossible to see any changes if you have this kind of scale. So more appropriate is to use a logarithmic scale, as this one does, and you can see that on the left-hand scale as it goes up in very large jumps. But again, there's just so much uncertainty in the graph as it's constructed. I don't think it's very useful. I don't really know what's going on with that huge jump and plateau that it shows. More important is it's showing no change for a couple thousand years, as I note. And I should say in all these slides, if I'm making additions to a slide from another source, I'll put my additions in that maroon colored font. But it's perhaps true that there was very little change in human population during that long period. You certainly don't see that locally. If you have studies of local areas, you see huge ups and downs in populations as reflected anyway by archaeological finds. So I'm pretty suspicious of all these sorts of graphs. What I would like to do in starting out with the substance of this lecture, though, is to look at crude estimates that we have of human population, say, about 100,000 years ago. Anatomically, modern human beings originated around 200,000 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier. So this is about halfway through the saga of anatomically modern human beings. I say anatomically modern because the bones that are found in certain areas, at least in Africa at this time, are within the range of modern human bones. That doesn't necessarily mean that people at this time were culturally or even intellectually the same as modern human beings. We don't know. There's good evidence that they were, but you don't see the kind of big jumps in, say, creativity that you will later on, and that's probably a cultural issue rather than a biological issue. But anyway, crude estimates are of modern humans at this time 100,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 to 500,000 years ago. Yeah, some of that might come from archaeological evidence, but that's really questionable because of what gets preserved and what doesn't. Better evidence from genetics, and the argument here is that there's relatively low levels of genetic diversity among human populations, leading scholars to think that if the human population had been much larger, we would have seen more diversity, particularly in African populations, the continent where humankind originated. Now, another question that we have to ask here is, well, what do we mean by human? Do we mean species in the genus Homo? Our species is Homo sapiens. Or do we simply mean anatomically modern people? Because up until around 40,000 years ago, and even after that, there were a number of archaic species, the best known one being Neanderthals, which I'll talk about in some detail. I would recommend people watch this YouTube video of David Reich, one of the leaders of the genetic revolution and understanding the deep past. An interview with Dwarkesh Patel. It's a long interview. It lasts a couple hours. They jump around up to a lot of topics that I will cover in this lecture and in the next lecture as well. The point, though, is that we have had an explosion in knowledge about the deep past of humankind because of the revolution in genetics, being able to decipher the human genome, find genetic material from um, long periods ago, analyze it, compare it to modern populations, and so on. So our knowledge has just exploded, but at the same time, um, the more we know, in one sense, the less we know, the more complicated it is becoming, or it appears to be. And David Reich really pushes this point in a really fascinating way, in my way of looking at it. He's sort of admits what we do know, what we don't know, how we interpret things, and the fact that there are many other possible interpretations. In fact, what he argues is that we have kind of a standard model of human evolution, and the more we know, the more problems we find, and we sort of make patches on that model, but he thinks the whole model might be mistaken. And he urges an open mind, which I think is very important. However, in this lecture, I will often sort of rely on the standard model. Useful for trying to understand this, but I just want to make sure that people know the uncertainty involved. So here's a bit of a dated map. That's one of the problems. The maps I can easily find often are because things are changing so fast. But it's pretty well understood, as I mentioned before, that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago. At that time, outside of Africa, there were many what are generally called archaic humans or archaic members of genus Homo. This map shows Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthals. They're often considered to be Homo sapiens, separate subspecies. I'll talk about that in a second. It has Homo erectus in many areas of Eastern and Southern and Southeast Asia. Homo erectus was definitely had much smaller brains than modern humans, unlike Neanderthals. It doesn't show the Denisovans, who have been more recently discovered. Very few bones, some teeth, a finger bone, a few others, but genetic material has been able to be recovered from that. And we know that Denisovans were a somewhat similar group to modern humans, interbred with modern humans on several different occasions. The basic view, though, was that Neanderthals were in the western part of Eurasia, Denisovans in the eastern part. This map also shows human beings spreading into the Americas. Those dates are old and questionable. Just to give you one example, so this map is showing human beings coming into the Americas over the Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and Alaska some 15,000 years ago. The oldest really credible archaeological site that we have in the Americas, Monteverde, 14,500 years ago, a pretty well-established date from radiocarbon dating. That's in southern Chile. So pretty hard to imagine that people would have crossed over 15,000 years ago and got to southern Chile in a mere a much longer period. So I noticed there's an small mistake there in my dating, but it's 14,500 years ago. Anyway, human bones and Neanderthal bones are very easily differentiated. There's no substantial overlap. You can see it in the skulls. Neanderthals, large skulls, different shaped skull. Not much of a forehead, much larger in the back, much more robust bones, bigger rib cage, bigger sort of bones, and you would have had larger tendons and muscles as well, stronger than anatomically modern humans. One very interesting thing about Neanderthal bones, and lots of them have been discovered, is they show a lot of breakage and healing. The closest modern analog would be rodeo performers, who often break their bones. And this is thought to be because Neanderthals hunted large animals and did so in a sort of close range fighting with spears and suffered a lot of damage in the process. So anyway, if the genus of humankind, I mentioned maybe 100,000 years ago, might have been a couple 100,000. Well, maybe if we include these archaic forms, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, maybe more than 1 million. But who knows? This is all quite guesswork. The reconstructions of these early archaic forms of humans are interesting. Artists have been tending to make Neanderthals look much more like modern humans recently, and less sort of bestial as they used to be done. We don't have preservation of soft tissue. We have to try to sort of imagine how they looked. So here's one reconstruction. Denisovans, I mean, like I said, we just have a few bones, and so all very much guesswork. Were Neanderthals and Denisovans in the same species as we are? Well, if you define species as a group of forms of life that interbreed with each other, as is often done, well, then definitely Neanderthals and Denisovans were in the same species, because there was quite a bit of interbreeding. Now, that interbreeding may have had problems. There may have been a good chance there was reduced fertility, the sort of thing that may lead one to say, no, really, we're separate species. But these encounters definitely happened. I mean, here's a map showing possible times. We know it happened a number of times. David Reich thinks it may have happened over and over again. It's hard to say. But these dates, around 40,000 years ago, that was sort of at the end of the Neanderthal period, although the bigger circle in the Near East, where the first encounters between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals occurred, it may have been an earlier date. And just an example of these enigmatic Denisovans, there were probably a number of different groups. David Reich says there may have been half a dozen pretty distinct subspecies or species of our genus in Eurasia in these early periods, and it shows we know that there were these interbreeding episodes. Every human being whose ancestry is outside of Africa is around 1-2% Neanderthal in the total genome here. Denisovans in East Asian population, percent or so. In Papua New Guinea, it's larger. I think it's up to something like 5%. And this diagram shows 3 occurrences of these Denisovan hominins at different times and in different places, interbreeding with anatomically modern humans and leaving their genes. So anyway, roughly 70,000 years ago, one group of modern humans spread outside of Africa. They seem to have had a very difficult time at first, but eventually spread all over Eurasia, and then ultimately into Australia, into the Americas, and so on, sort of giving rise to all non-African population groups. So during this period, there's the total population of modern humans is expanding because new territories are being occupied. Is population density going up? Well, probably in some places, but overall not much. The population of modern humans, population density was probably greater than that of these archaic humans, although that is debatable, but from archaeological remains it often looks so. And more important, perhaps, or equally important, was the eventual extinction of all those archaic Homo populations. So in Europe, there was a period where modern humans and Neanderthals were both on the continent, but by around 40,000 years or so, the Neanderthals pretty much disappeared. They may have had a last area where they lived in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, but eventually they go extinct. Lots of debates over how that happened. Also, this is this map also is a bit older. It has this range of the Denisovans and the even more archaic Homo erectus in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. But Denisova Cave, where the first bones were found, it's in southern Siberia, well to the north, and I've marked that on the map. One other thing to note when looking at these maps is that the sea levels were much lower at this time. We're still in the Pleistocene Ice Age. You can see a big glacier over northern Europe. You can also see glaciers in the Himalayan mountains and the Tibetan Plateau. And you can also see that the Asian continent extended into what is now the islands of Southeast Asia. Islands like Borneo, Sumatra, Java were part of the Asian continent, and people and animals could simply walk into there. Australia, a much larger Australia, was separate. So just a few things to note there. So anyway, the anatomically modern humans essentially replaced Neanderthals and Denisovans, although interbred with them at the same time. Most scholars would probably think, though, that it was modern humans that drove them extinct through competition, through outright conflict. It's hard to say. But it does seem to be that there were certain advantages that modern humans had over these archaic people. No advantage in brain size, as I mentioned. Neanderthal brains were actually a little bit larger than modern human brains, but a different brain shape. It may have been that modern humans had a better developed prefrontal cortex right behind the forehead, which is usually thought as the center of its sort of advanced cognition. Maybe Neanderthal brains were larger because they had more acute visual processing or olfactory, a bit better sense of smell. Nobody really knows. This is a lot of hypothesis. Certainly, Neanderthals were quite capable of sort of advanced symbolic thought through ornamentation. We can see it in burial practices and so on. But it also may well be that these anatomically modern humans, and especially the group, in general, had a more flexible and adaptable cultures. They could change and respond more to different conditions, perhaps. Language is much debated. I think most scholars probably, the general view is the Neanderthals, and presumably Denisovans as well, did have language. Some scholars doubt this. This is actually discussed in that David Reich interview that I mentioned, and he's actually quite sort of uncertain about whether he even wants to talk about it because it's so controversial, but he cites a paper that would indicate that certain genes that are important for speech were present in Neanderthals but were turned off through epigenetic markers. So anyway, controversial. Did modern humans probably had much larger social networks? A lot of the Neanderthal groups seem to have been quite relatively isolated, long periods of time, not breeding with other Neanderthal groups. Modern humans seem to have had more, at least by this time, more genetic exchange and probably more cultural exchange, so probably these larger social networks. Like as the slide shows, yes, more interbreeding among different human populations, which meant eventually you're going to get more genetic diversity. Neanderthals are thought to have been actually weakened by what is known by as genetic load, which means if you have these relatively small groups of people interbreeding, breeding just amongst themselves and not with other groups, you're going to build up genetic mutations over time. The vast majority of genetic mutations are negative and will be weeded out by natural selection if it has a chance to operate. Here's another way to look at this, and again, I'm going back to that David Reich interview, and I pose the question: did modern humans, exterminate these archaic groups, or did they just genetically swamp them out over time? The latter is an unusual position. David Reich entertains it, which is why I think it's important to bring it up. But as I mentioned before, all non-African populations have a small percentage of Neanderthal genes. But Reich, citing some other scholars, says that the actual numbers of our ancestors, we being non-Africans, our non-African percentage of Neanderthal ancestors were much higher. If you go back 70,000 years ago, perhaps 10 to 20% of ancestors of non-African populations were archaic, Neanderthal, one of the Denisovans, or so on. And you might wonder, how does that square with the figure that we only have 1 to 5% ancestry in our genes? Well, the argument is that natural selection weeded out most of the genes from Neanderthals and from Denisovans. They did that because there were this genetic load with negative mutations, so they would simply be weeded out by differential survival, hence natural selection. Some of the genes that were kept from Neanderthals or Denisovans probably had some adaptive advantage. This could have to do with things like immune system. People in the Tibetan Plateau definitely have Denisovan ancestry, and it's thought those genes may have been helpful in adapting to the very harsh conditions up at 10, 12,000 foot elevation with much lower oxygen. As is found. So perhaps, I'm certainly no expert on this. I find it fascinating and worth pursuing, but also it's kind of frustrating because there are so many interpretations and things are changing so rapidly. A lot of evidence, genetic evidence, suggests there was a lot of movement by early modern humans over vast distances over time, not all at once, but lots of movement. And one way to look at this is by looking at what are known as haplogroups. These are from particular ways of looking at the male line and the female line. So you can look at male lineages, so from son to father to grandfather all the way back, of what is known as Y DNA from the Y chromosome, something that women don't have. Women XX, men XY. So look at that Y, and you can get these groups that you can trace out, many of which originated tens of thousands of years ago, and you could see just on the map on the left how much they've spread. You can trace the female line, and this is for both, you can do it both for men and women, just looking at their mothers, grandmothers, and so on through the mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondria are these little power packs in each cell. Probably were originally some sort of bacteria that was engulfed by a cell. I mean, it's all animals have it. But the mitochondrial DNA, you see a similar patterns if you were to trace back to your great, 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 so on and so on grandmother. You get these huge differences. And another way of looking at it is have these pie charts where you have particular what are known as haplogroups, which were groups of descent on the Y chromosome, as this map shows, and you could see there's regional patterning to be sure, but also just a tremendous amount of diversity, particularly in the central part of Eurasia, a real crossroads. So you can see much less as you get into sort of more peripheral areas. And a similar sort of thing with the with the mitochondrial haplogroups, indicating there had been a lot of movement. This idea of migration, of large-scale rapid movement. We don't really know how rapid those movements were, although, well, as we'll see later, a lot of the genetic studies from more recent periods does indicate some pretty rapid movement. I'll talk about that in next lecture, for example, when we look at a group called the Yamnaya, who were the first people to domesticate horses and develop a migratory pastoral lifestyle in Central Eurasia based on horses. Their gene spread remarkably fast. It was definitely a migration. But until recently, archaeologists were very wary about attributing changes to large-scale migration. This is partly because the view was that in the early 20th century, migration was over generalized by archaeologists. It also got embroiled in the whole racial or pseudo-racial science controversy, where German and other scholars would look at a new set of pots coming into archaeological sites in Europe and would associate that with the spread of the Nordic or Aryan race. So it was discredited by its associations with Nazi ideology. It was a reaction after World War II by archaeologists who just said, well, we don't have to believe in any migrations. Okay, you get a new set of pots appearing. Well, maybe people just started making new pots, or they borrowed it from their neighbors. We don't have to assume that there was any movement or any replacement. And I have, I illustrate here this with a photo of Colin Renfrew. You could see a very famous, at one time probably the most famous archaeologist, wrote a very influential book called Archaeology and Language on the puzzle of Indo-European language family. And he argued that we don't have to hypothesize any large-scale migration, any sort of interviolence between groups. Rather, there was just this very slow movement, demic diffusion, meaning, let's say you have, well, he thought farmers from what is now Turkey or Anatolia spread the Indo-European language into Europe when they spread farming. And so you had farmers who were sort of building up their local population, and those at the edge of the farming territory would move a few miles then into new territory. And that happened for a couple thousand years ago, and that's how agriculture spread. No need to posit any sort of migrations. And he and others argued that you didn't really get large-scale migrations until you had states emerging in the historical epoch. I have to say, interesting theory. It has been thoroughly discredited by the genetic research that's come up, which shows that back certainly many thousands of years ago, human groups have been moving large distances, and sometimes we can show did so pretty quickly. One thing that you may have heard of, and I'm going to discredit this thesis, but an idea that around 70,000 years ago, 74,000 years ago to be precise, and remember that's just when modern humans, at least the modern human group that's ancestral to non-Africans, was spreading out of Africa and starting to spread across Eurasia. It has been argued, though, that they were almost wiped out by a gigantic volcanic eruption. So here's an NPR article from 2012, how humans almost vanished from the earth. And notice they're saying humans, all humans. Well, the eruption itself was a Toba eruption in Sumatra in Indonesia. As this graph shows, the sort of total magnitude of that eruption 74,000 years ago, and then comparing it with other large eruptions. Some of you may remember Mount St. Helens in Washington, or Pinatubo in the Philippines, and then just compare it in size. It also shows the Yellowstone caldera, which did go off some 600,000 years ago. I mean, these are mammoth explosions, which would have resulted in what's sometimes called volcanic winter in some areas for a couple years, covered vast areas with volcanic ash, could have wiped out a lot of local populations. And the argument was it was so extreme that it almost wiped out humankind. Example here would be, just to show you Lake Toba. That's the island of Sumatra on the left, the Malay Peninsula on the right. And you can see this huge lake with a big island in the middle. Well, that lake is essentially the caldera of this volcano, to show you how large it was. So anyway, this thesis was that there was this bottleneck. I say this is a highly unlikely reconstruction. I put it in because it was commonly believed, and not that long ago. So I had to add a few things to this slide, but it's showing a pretty substantial human population and almost disappearing for a long time and then finally coming back. Well, that is not the case. Recent research really casts doubt on this. Toba probably had very little effect in Africa, the original home of humankind, and even outside of Africa wasn't as bad as previously had been thought. But, there is a but there. Genetic evidence does show that non-African populations had, after coming in, had declined. So they're coming into, at least the main group coming in around 70,000 years ago from Africa, and then declining significantly. And this is seen in genetics, again, and I don't really understand how the research works. But anyway, there evidently was a decrease of non-African populations, 5 to 15-fold reduction, with only some 1,000 to 3,000 remaining individuals at 50,000 years ago, consistent with earlier mitochondrial DNA studies. David Reich didn't really talk about this. I would love to have got his view on it. I suspect that this may be a bit exaggerated, but it's hard to argue against this kind of genetic evidence. However, about right at about the same time or shortly thereafter, modern humans, anatomically modern humans, did start to spread into new parts of the world, in particular Australia. There are you could see on the map here 50,000 years ago, people got to Australia. They had never had any archaic humans, no Homo erectus, nothing like that. So it was a completely new continent to anything like us. So people got there. They would have had to have crossed water, used some sort of primitive watercraft. But when people got to a completely new environment without any competitors, it was sort of easy pickings, and the local population would have almost certainly increased relatively rapidly. Let's look at a map of what Australia looked like at the time. So this is during the glacial period. A lot of ocean waters locked up in massive ice caps. The glacier sitting over the Hudson Bay was 10,000 feet thick. So sea levels were much lower. So if you can trace out the outlines, you can see Australia there. You can see the huge island of New Guinea to the north, smaller island of Tasmania to the south. They were all one continent. You can see that western part of Indonesia was part of the Asian continent, but there were several gaps that would have had to have been crossed. Archaeological evidence indicates that within a couple hundred years, at least all of the coastal zone of Australia, of mega Australia, if you will, was occupied by people. So that would have been certainly an expansion of the human range and an expansion of human numbers. So after this bottleneck, a new era of expansion is taking off. And also, if we go back to this earlier map, you can see about 40,000 years ago with anatomically modern people entering Europe, occupied by Neanderthals. And then it's showing 25,000 years ago for sort of the central part of Eurasia, probably earlier than that. But what about the Americas? The old line, the classic line it wasn't until about 15,000 years ago. People came from Siberia. They moved into what is now central Alaska. So you could see the so-called Bering Land Bridge. So sea levels were much lower. The Bering Sea is quite shallow. This would have been a very cold grassland or steppe at the time. It was not covered by ice. It was too dry for that. But you could see the ice cap over North America extending all the way down to the, central southern Illinois. Long Island in New York was a terminal moraine of one of these continental glaciers. But the old model was in showing this blue line, this overland route, and you can see it's crossing the ice cap. How could that have happened? Well, as glaciers started to shrink, a ice-free corridor would have emerged because there were actually two ice caps here that were joined together, one centered over Hudson Bay, the other over British Columbia. So as they started to shrink, an opening would have come up. People could have marched down through there and entered the Americas. And there's a lot of evidence for this. I mean, it almost certainly did happen. So people, large mammal hunting human beings with spears and a particular kind of spear called a Clovis point, came in and spread. So that's probably true, but there were probably people already in the Americas, maybe just on the coasts and not inland. So we have here a coastal route. You can see in red here, hypothesized as 20,000 to 16,000 years ago, with the overland route 14,000 years ago. There's also a possible route from Europe. That's unlikely, and I don't think it's worth talking about, although who knows. Genetics has contributed some very interesting things to this. So genetics does show that there was this movement from Siberia. It actually occurred several different times. There were at least 3 different episodes that we know of. But there were, like I said, pre-existing human beings. And one of the lines of evidence is this bizarre finding among indigenous peoples in the Amazon that there are certain components of their genome that link them to Australia and Melanesia, the islands off of Australia, places like New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. So there are certain genetic characteristics of these groups, and they have been found not in North America, but in Amazonia, and I think more recently elsewhere. So here's an article on this deep affinity between coastal Pacific and Amazonian natives, evidenced by Australasian, in other words, Australian Aboriginal or Papuan from New Guinea, or just that general area of the world. How could that have happened? Well, again, by this coastal movement. And some lines of evidence would indicate that early humans were partly or maybe even largely a coastal species. Coastal areas often offer they're often very rich environments, a lot of protein with shellfish in particular. It's hard for most animals to crack a mussel shell, but humans, or well, even pre-humans, even Australopithecus could do that with rocks. Being able to use tools to crush them, and evidence is emerging. Here's an article from showing that ancient people relied on coastal environments to survive the last glacial maximum. Well, again, who knows? People were definitely not only at the coast, but that may have been a preferred area. Now, one might think, well, we'd have a lot more archaeological finds from coastal areas, but remember the sea level was 150 feet lower or so. So those coastal sites from this period would now be underwater. And although underwater archaeology is done, a lot of very interesting shipwrecks, for example, back to the Bronze Age, have been discovered in the Black Sea and other places. It's not the sort of thing where you can go out and very easily find sites in this, especially off the Pacific coast of the U.S. So anyway, this is sometimes called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. So early people all the way down from the Australian area would have gone up along the coast. You could see here on the very far left of this, you can see that red line going out. That would be what are now the Aleutian Islands, but they would have been joined together. Even though there were big ice caps, it wouldn't have gone all the way down to the sea in many or most areas at any rate. So people could have moved along, and maybe they didn't even go inland. Maybe they would just sort of stayed in the coastal area. And then later, these Siberian peoples, big game hunters, came in through that ice-free corridor. And it's hypothesized that these earlier people were really not much involved, or maybe at all, in hunting mammoths or mastodons or these other very, very large species that these later immigrants did hunt. Now, when humans first got to the Americas, they would have encountered a kind of wildlife of equal diversity to that found in Africa today. Africa has far more large mammals than any other continent. Eurasia would be next, and much lower numbers in the Americas or Australia. But that wasn't always the case by any means. That's a very, very recent thing. It's only been true for the last 10, 12,000 years. So here's an illustration from La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, where lots of mammals were trapped. We can see labeled as primates, a human being, to give size comparison. So we have an imperial mammoth, larger than a woolly mammoth. We have a mastodon, which looks a lot like an elephant, but is a very different animal. We got 3 kinds of giant ground sloths. Eastern United States had much larger giant ground sloths. Some were as big as an elephant. And then all kinds of other species, most of which, 80% or so, became extinct right at about this time, right at around 10, 12,000 years ago, when large animal hunting humans were coming in and spreading, when the climate was changing, when the ice age was ending, when warmer conditions were emerging. So a lot was happening at this time. Later on, I'll talk about the development of agriculture in the Near East. It was happening at about the same time as well. Just to make a couple other points on this. So some animals that we really associate, we don't associate with North America. We'll take the horse. Actually, horses and camels Both of those lineages evolved in the Americas. They later spread to Eurasia, Africa. Then they went extinct in the Americas, and then in the case of horses, and to some extent camels, were reintroduced in the modern era. So this graphic just shows showing animals that went extinct, some of those that survived. Africa had by far the smallest number of extinctions at this time, although it did happen. Australia and the Americas had the most. So you could see in the text here about 65% of all megafauna, that just means large animals, went extinct here around 12,000 years ago. This has 72% in North America, 83% in South America, 88% in Australia. Scientists have been debating Pleistocene extinctions and the cause of it for a long time, and I don't think it's ever going to be settled. So here we have on the left, scenario one is basically the human overkill hypothesis, where everything's going fine. People come in and they encounter naive animals. Now, that may sound ridiculous, but we know from islands that had not been inhabited until European mariners found them that the wildlife was naive. They on the islands of Mauritius and Réunion in the Indian Ocean, pretty large, fertile islands. Didn't have any mammals, but they had dodo birds, these large flightless pigeons, several feet tall, and they were wiped out quite quickly, and they were wiped out because, at least initially, they were hunted by just walking up to them and clubbing them because they were not afraid of people. They had no knowledge. So according to this argument, humans evolved on Africa with wildlife, so there was never any, they were never naive. They always knew about these very dangerous primates, whereas in places like Australia and the Americas, you had this naive wildlife. Scenario 2 shows that it's much more varied in time. It happened over a longer period. Humans involved, but probably more an issue of climate change. That might seem odd because the climate was changing for the better. Things were becoming warmer and wetter, more productive ecosystems. But during the period of change, there was almost certainly a tremendous amount of very destabilizing fluctuations, rapidly changing climatic weather conditions, massive floods as glaciers began to recede, and so on. So that may well have played a role. I do want to mention, though, that the timing of megafauna extinction suggests that humans played some role. Probably not the only factor, but the fact that there was relatively little extinction in Africa, much more in Eurasia, and then 50,000 years ago, Australia, and then you can see here 11,000 years ago in North America and South America, and then finally, the last big land areas that humans reached, Madagascar off the coast of Africa and New Zealand, it only happened 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. New Zealand had a large array of not mammals, but of large flightless birds. The moas were much larger than ostriches. They went extinct pretty soon after people got there. But I should say there are some who say, well, it wasn't necessarily people. Maybe it was the rats that were on their ships that came in and ate their eggs. I mean, who knows? Madagascar had been separated from Africa for a long time, had a lot of mammals, but very distinctive lineages. For example, no monkeys, but lemurs, another kind of primate. There's still lemurs in Madagascar, but there used to be a lot more. And the largest lemurs, ground-dwelling lemurs that were more active in the daytime rather than at night, they tended to go extinct. All the really large ones went extinct, and they happened when people reached Madagascar. And so I bring this up because it sort of shows the possibility, maybe the probability, of very severe levels of environmental destruction or degradation with the coming of people. Encountering these new landscapes. Their human population was no doubt fairly rapidly growing because there were so many resources and no competition. We have this new not just keystone predator, but sort of ultimate keystone predator coming in. So food would have been abundant. Population probably expanded quite rapidly. So to link this back to the theme of the class, these may have been what we might think of as early examples of population explosions. The evidence is very unclear, and so there's got to be a lot of speculation involved in this. Last thing I'll mention with this, though, is the last stand of the woolly mammoths. So woolly mammoths were all over northern North America, northern Eurasia. They lived in the tundra zone, very long hair. I mean, we find them in Siberia often in permafrost. And so we not only have their bones, we have their fur, we have the genetic material. One reason why some people think they should be brought back. Very closely related to the Asian elephant. Asian elephants are more related to mammoths than they are to African elephants. So they potentially could be brought back, but by using an Asian elephant host. So that's been discovered. But they went extinct in both in North America and in Eurasia at the end of the last glacial period, the end of the Ice Age, 12,000 years ago or so. But they survived on one island, on the island north of Siberia, Wrangel Island. It's part of Russia today. Human beings did not reach that till much later, so the mammoths continued to live there until about 4,000 years ago. So it wasn't that the climate became such that mammoths could no longer live, because they continued to live there. It's a pretty small island, though, and populations of large animals are very vulnerable on small islands because they don't have that many members of the species. And if you have some really cold summer, for example, it could just be such that it would wipe them out. If you had a larger range, they would have survived somewhere else and then repopulated it. Moving on to just sort of looking at conditions, let's say 18,000 years ago. So I'm gone back a few thousand years. I'm not talking about this period of 12,000 years ago when Pleistocene extinctions occurred. But I use 18,000 years ago because that was sort of the height of the glacial period, the coldest temperatures. Very difficult and demanding climates in most areas. Not everywhere. You still had rainforests along the equator and restricted belts. But just note these huge ice caps over North America, over Europe, mountain glaciers elsewhere. Not only was it colder, it was also much drier. Warmer climate generally is going to lead to more evaporation, more moisture in the atmosphere, more precipitation. So we can see some extreme deserts in places where you don't find them today, right in the heart of South America, for example, the Orinoco region of Venezuela, several others. It's a very crude map. Closed forest just means a forest with complete canopy coverage. It's showing it going right up to the ice cap in North America. I don't think that's true. I'm pretty sure it's not true. But anyway, I won't go into any detail on this, but this is just a more complicated map of global environments. The dark green are tropical rainforests, and you can see there's some in South America, a little bit in Africa, a little bit in Southeast Asia, but much more restricted than they would later become because it's colder, drier conditions overall. Well, what was the population? Get back to the theme of this course. We don't really know. This is giving, again, the Upper Paleolithic. That means the Paleolithic is the old Stone Age. Upper means more recent, thinking about it in terms of archaeological excavations. The deeper down you dig, the older it gets. So I've looked for as many estimations as I could find. They varied from 1 to 10 million. Most said, most likely around 4 to 6 million by this time. So this is when populations are expanding in the Americas. People had been in Australia already for a long period of time, over most of Eurasia, and of course in Africa. And I think this is a pretty good illustration of possible conditions. It's showing people sort of living under a big rock overhang, as they often did, but people were not simply restricted to living in caves. There were places in what is now Russia, where they were building dwellings out of mammoth bones. We know that from archaeological excavations. I'll be looking a lot about health changes as agriculture is developed. And the agricultural revolution starts in the Near East, right at about the time of the end of the last ice age and the time of Pleistocene extinctions. If you look at the pre-agricultural populations of Europe, and particularly these upper Paleolithic populations, so this is during the Ice Age, glacial period, Cro-Magnon is a general term used for fully modern humans who replace Neanderthals. A life expectancy 30 to 34 years. That may sound very dismal, but actually that is not bad for early humankind. Those numbers are going to go down later on. Cro-Magnons were fairly large, about the same size as people are today. Very well, people today are much better nourished than our ancestors were 500 years ago, and as a result, we're taller, and it varies from culture to culture. But Cro-Magnons were generally quite a large group of early humans. The life expectancy at 15, if you could live to be 15, would be about 40 to 50. So there was a lot of childhood and infant mortality, as was true everywhere, all populations up until modern times with modern medicine. Our species is kind of uniquely vulnerable in that we have such high rates of maternal death, and with women dying in childbirth, and of death of infants. Maybe 10% lived past the age of 50, and we tell this from bones that are found. Like I say, of course, high childhood and maternal mortality. But these skeletons were relatively tall, and they had relatively good teeth and bones. So fairly well nourished, but a rough life nonetheless. Anyway, let's move on now to the last topic I want to cover in this lecture, which is now the end of the Pleistocene Ice Age or glacial period, start of the Holocene, which is the period that we're in now, much warmer conditions, retreat of the glaciers. They don't disappear. We still have an ice cap over Greenland and another one over Antarctica, but the larger ice caps are equally as large as that in Antarctica, found over North America, and then another one over Northern Europe. But 11,700 years, that's pretty precise. We just get rapid warming. There had been some warming earlier, then a return to cold, but then this one takes off and it sticks. So the black line on that graph shows showing a temperature anomaly. It's indicating a climactic optimum some 8,000 years ago, with relatively warm temperatures, and then they gradually decline, and then they shoot up more recently with anthropogenic or human-caused global warming. And there's a little box showing that recent spiking well above what we had. And I'll talk about some of these issues later on. But it's undeniable that at this time, 11,700 years ago, very rapid warming across the world and rapid vegetational change. The ice caps are retreating and big ones disappearing. Forests are spreading. It's also, there's a few thousand years of very wet period where extreme deserts are greatly limited. Note there's no Sahara Desert here, and the Sahara Desert is by far the largest extreme desert in the world today. Many areas of the Central Sahara get less than an inch of rain a year. I mean, just very, very dry. But it wasn't there 8,000 years ago. Here's actually a map, two pair of maps, one showing current conditions and then conditions in the early Holocene, say 8,000 years ago or so. And you could see those white areas very restricted. Most of the Sahara Desert was gone. It was grassland or savanna. We have a lot of rock art from people at this time depicting large herds of gazelles and other animals. So very, very different conditions. This was a period of tremendous change, obviously, and big change for humankind and for human population this is also the period of the first agriculture. This map shows in orange areas, 6 areas of independent origin of agriculture. In other words, not influenced by other peoples who had agriculture, but people coming up with farming, domesticating crops all on their own. And you can see there's different timing. The earliest is the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Near East, about 11,000 years before present. In other words, right at about this, a little bit after this major change in the climate of warming. Also a period when while a lot of large mammals are going extinct, not as many as in the Americas or Australia, but extinction did occur in Eurasia as well, even some in Africa. So we could see one a bit later in central China, 9,000 years ago. Another one, very surprising, New Guinea highlands. New Guinea highlands, a big plateau in central New Guinea. This was an area that the outside world really didn't know about till the 1920s. Australian gold prospectors started going up the mountains. They found big plateaus and more than 1 million people living there. Quite a surprise because there was really no knowledge of this in the outside world. But it turns out their ancestors had domesticated crops a long time ago. 2 very common crops, sugarcane and bananas, were probably domesticated in New Guinea. Then we actually see 3 in the Americas, one in the Andean region of South America, one in central Mexico, one in the Midwest of the United States. That's a very interesting one because almost all the crops they domesticated disappeared when their ancestors got the crops from central Mexico. So the central Mexicans had, well, the 3 big ones were corn, beans, and squash, whereas the residents of eastern United States had domesticated a lot of plants today that would be considered weeds, like sumpweed, for example. Only 2 of their crops survive, sunflowers and something called the Jerusalem artichoke, which is not an artichoke, it's a tuber. It's actually related to sunflowers. So the other ones they dropped. Evidently they were not particularly tasty. A lot of people were allergic to them. So they're quite interesting. We have dates here 5,000 years ago for Mexico. It may well have been earlier. So they weren't all at the same time. So you can't say, agriculture came about because the end of the last ice age changed climate. People are adapting to a new environment. And that's how they had to do it. Well, that may well have happened in the Near East. Other places, was different. It probably happened because of increasing population pressures, slowly building up population. People generally didn't, let's put it this way, agriculture wasn't something that was obviously beneficial. When people first started to develop agriculture, their health and longevity went down, not up. But the important thing is you can support far more people in any given area in an agricultural economy than you can in a hunting-gathering one. So it may well be that just increasing population pressure led people to experiment, make changes, and start to develop crops. A red line on the map, there's 2, one in the Americas, one in the Eastern Hemisphere, that just shows the extent of agriculture, I'll say at about 500 years ago. And you could see the lines on this map showing the spread of agriculture. And that spread largely because of the population of farmers spreading. I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's look particularly at the Near East or Middle East, if you will. So you have the Mediterranean on the left. You get a little bit of the Persian Gulf and Caspian Sea on the right. So we have modern-day countries of Turkey, Israel, Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Egypt is shown there as well. But it's the area of inside those lines that show the range of the wild progenitors of some of our most important crops, particularly wheat, a couple different strains of wheat, as well as barley. These were some of the earliest grains domesticated, and also areas where sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs may well have been domesticated. They may have been domesticated in other places as well later on, particularly pigs and cattle. Sheep and goat were the earliest ones, right at about this same time. So why did the people in this place at this time start to domesticate crops and animals and become farmers. Well, it may have had a lot to do with the very difficult conditions with the changes of climate, rapid fluctuations, um, disappearance of a number of animals, or at least reduction in numbers probably going on. And probably people were propelled by some sort of pressure or even subsistence crisis to do this. Because one thing they started to do is gathering seeds in very large numbers, which takes a lot of work. It's very laborious to gather them, to process them, and to turn them into something edible. So large seeds had been eaten for a long time, but they hadn't been the main source of sustenance. And with the agricultural revolution, they become the main source of sustenance. Interesting speculation about this particular area with this movement to a diet based on seeds. With the change of the climate at this time, there would have been a real spread of plants that produce large seeds, annual plants, plants that produce large seeds so they can get a quick start. They grow in their growing season, they seed out again, and then they die, as opposed to perennials. Most grasses are perennials. They live for many years, and they produce very small seeds that you really can't eat or not any significant way. But for these annual grasses, and not just grasses, also legumes. So early domesticates included in this area things like lentils, peas, chickpeas, or garbanzo beans. So again, large seeds, annual plants. So with the new climate, suddenly you get long, hot, dry seasons, which you wouldn't have had before. In the glacial periods, you would have had much cooler summers. Perennial grasses are much more common. And then in the new climate with this long, hot, dry season, it's speculated that these annual plants would have done better. People would have started to have gathered them and would have moved into agriculture. Now, I have to say, or it's important to note, that there's a lot of controversy about how this process went on. There are some scholars who think that agriculture was propelled more than anything else by the desire for public feasting, in particular turning grass seeds, malting them, and turning into beer or alcoholic beverage. There are some sites in Turkey in particular where just before the domestication of agriculture, you had people who were intensively gathering wild grass seeds, and even though they would not have been living in permanent habitations at this time, they were building big, impressive rock sort of shelters or ceremonial sites. And there's evidence from actually stone basins that they were brewing beer. So the idea is here that people were gathering these large amounts of seeds to create alcoholic beverages, to have periodic feasts bringing in large numbers of people who are normally scattered far away. So again, I bring this up just to show you that there are many possibilities here. Our knowledge is by no means complete or certain. We're just trying to piece this together. But we do know pretty much for sure that this was the first place that agriculture developed. So it's a Mediterranean climate, much like that of California. In those areas enclosed by those lines at any rate. You can see the Fertile Crescent extending down into Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, modern Iraq. Most of that, well, particularly in the south, it's too dry to simply grow these crops. You need to irrigate them, and that comes in a big way a few thousand years later. But in the initial period, it's just using the rain. So you have to have a place where you get abundant winter rain, as is typical of Mediterranean climate. So you sow your seeds in the fall. When the rains come, you harvest them in the spring. I will note that there are Mediterranean climate zones everywhere in the world between 30 and 40 degrees latitude on the west side of continents. So we have California, central Chile, the Cape region of South Africa, southwest Australia, part of South Australia as well. None of them saw anything like this. In fact, California, Western Cape were not agricultural at all until Europeans came in, or the same was true of Australia. Central Chile did have agriculture, but that had come in from the Andes Mountains with a very different environment. What happened after the development of agriculture is usually called the Neolithic Revolution. So agriculture, in one sense, is revolutionary because it produces so much food. You get domesticated crops and animals. Neolithic's marked by polished stone tools, by the development of permanent habitations in almost everywhere except a very few favored spots. Hunter-gatherers have to be quite mobile. They have to move from location to location to location. They do not build permanent habitations. There are certain areas that they're often staying in, but they're not building houses that we're going to find permanently occupied houses. They would have had temporary shelters, to be sure, but not this sort of thing. Pottery comes, although that takes a little bit longer. You could see there's a reconstruction of a Neolithic house in Turkey here, but it's noticed as a pre-pottery or pre-ceramic. That comes not long afterwards. So you can see, again, using baskets, using stone edge tools to harvest and have a lifestyle based on this. Back to population, the most important thing here, and I've mentioned it before, but I'll dwell on a little bit more, is there's pronounced population growth with agriculture, and much larger local populations can be supported. So this graphic from the Wikipedia on the Neolithic demographic transition, we see a certain population with sort of ups and downs, and then boom, a big increase. In sort of a rule of thumb, agriculturalists are going to be able to be 5 times, 10 times more populous on the ground because with agriculture you can simply support far more people in a given area than you could with hunting and gathering. Then there's going to be, the population is going to go up to a certain level. Then there's going to be stabilization because sort of a carrying capacity can be reached. Although it's going to go up and down, there will be periods of greater population. This is going to be linked to changing climates. There'll also be, as we will see in this class abundantly, a lot of periods of population collapse too, a lot of ups and downs. There is solid evidence of this demographic transformation after the initiation of agriculture. It's found in different parts of the world, as this article puts it in the title, Rapid Global Demographic Expansions After the Origin of Ancestor. Estimates of the timing of population growth based on genetic data correspond neatly to dates of the initial origins of agriculture derived from archaeological evidence. Human fertility increased with agriculture. More births. I'll talk about that in a bit later. One thing that's kind of seems counterintuitive and really interesting, though, from this article is an abrupt increase in the proportion of juvenile skeletons as opposed to what you find with hunter-gatherers. So a lot, population is going up, but you're also having a lot more deaths of young people. At least more of their skeletons are appearing. That would indicate that fertility would have gone up quite a bit. And it's estimated an increase in the total fertility rate of 2 births per woman. Today, 2 births per woman is replacement level. Back before we had modern medicine, the replacement level was much higher, 4 to 6 or so. It depends on how healthy a given society was. But that's a big increase. So what are some of the reasons for this population spurt with agriculture? Well, one is increased human fertility. Shorter periods of nursing. So nursing children really reduces fertility in women. It's really suppressed. I mean, it does happen, but much less likely for a nursing woman to become pregnant. There's shorter periods of nursing. Hunter-gatherers, we know from modern studies, often children would be nursed till 4, even 5 years of age. That was even true in some agricultural societies. But with a steady supply of grain, grain was originally eaten mostly as mush or porridge, pablum. It's easier to wean children on that. Also, less travel, and a lot of this has to do with weight gain. So, for a young woman to become fertile, she needs to have a certain amount of body fat. Was sometimes difficult for hunter-gatherers, periods of food shortage, also a lot of travel, of movement, so sort of being sedentary would allow the weight gain necessary for fertility. Much more stable and storable food supply. A real advantage of grain. There are many disadvantages of grain, but one advantage is that it can be stored for long periods of time, quite in a stable sense. There's probably much less vulnerability to famine. Hunter-gatherers had a lot of sort of feast and famine. It depends on the environment they lived in. But one thing that David Reich talks about in that interview that I mentioned is it's very clear in the last 10,000 years among agricultural populations, there's been a selection against genes for storing fat. Kind of surprising because we obviously have most of us, a great capacity to store fat if we eat too much and don't exercise as much. But evidently, a lot of genes that help the storing of fat on the human body were much more prevalent during periods when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and then moving into agriculture, it's selected against because it's sort of not needed. Of course, there's increased carrying capacity of the land. I've talked about it as well. But also, high fertility was matched by high mortality. And important to note that in all these cases, I've even used the term population explosion with people moving into new environments. It's still quite gradual compared to modern times with the real population explosion that comes especially in the 19th and 20th centuries with modern medicine and so on. Now, it's also really important to note the downside of the Neolithic Revolution or the development of agriculture. Decreased health, decreased vitality, decreased stature. It is definitely there. You can see it in the skeletal remains. So this article noting, and I'll just quote from the bottom here where I've put it in bold font, declines in oral health, in other words, teeth, spread of pathogens, diseases, infectious diseases, diseases from animals, a variety of ailments which have been linked to nutritional deficiencies and increased physical stress on the human body. So my second to last slide here, why did health, stature, and longevity decrease after the adoption of agriculture? Well, a couple of reasons. One is sedentary life and pollution of the water supply. So hunter-gatherers are moving. They'll stay in one place for a while, but then they move on. And they don't pollute their water supplies with their own waste. When you are sedentary and are staying in one place, it's actually very easy for human waste to get into the water supply. This was a problem that bedeviled modern people up until, I'll say in Europe, it really wasn't until the late 1800s that they got a good supply of water that wasn't going to cause you to get some serious disease. I'll talk about that quite a bit later on. So that took a long time. Close proximity to domestic livestock. Often early farmers and even recent farmers live really close to their to their domesticated animals, and a lot of diseases, probably most of them, jump from animals to human beings. And that's still an issue today when we worry about new strains of the flu. Where are they coming from? They're coming from birds, from chickens, from ducks, or from hogs. So it's an issue that has not gone away. A less varied diet. One thing about hunter-gatherers is they certainly had periods of want and famine. That's pretty clear, but they also had a much wider array of things that they were eating. Generally, they were getting pretty good levels of protein through hunting. They were getting a lot of different kinds of vitamins and so on. When the transition to agriculture occurs, much more reliance on grain, less diversity, And especially as population goes up, decreased consumption of animal proteins. You know, that changes with the development of dairying and so on. I'll talk about that later on. But it took a while for that to happen. So problems with nutrition, increased starch consumption, and dental decay. You don't get much dental decay when you go back to Paleolithic groups, and when people are eating mostly grains, that's starting to happen. There's also crowding conditions. Actually, some of these Neolithic communities were very dense. People crowded together. Famous site in Turkey, Catalhuyuk, where basically it was just solid, massive houses, and people would enter through the roofs. But people are crowding together, and that will allow the spread of more diseases. I have too much work with a question mark. Well, that especially happens as population pressures start to build up. One thing that agriculture involves is a lot more work than hunting and gathering did. And we could see in places, especially where there's high population density, of wear on bones and stuff, that people were really working themselves very hard. And then the last thing here is larger societies and the development of endemic diseases. So these are diseases that never disappear. They circulate around a population. Smallpox would be a good example. Smallpox, very common before modern medicine. In hunter-gatherer populations, smallpox couldn't be maintained. Maybe smallpox would move in, it would kill some people, but they weren't close enough, and so it couldn't jump enough from group to group, and so it would come into a smaller group. Some would die, some would survive, but that would be the end of that disease in that society. When the population level got large enough locally, you could have societies where smallpox would come in. It would affect one village, move on to another village, move on to another, and eventually come back to the first after a number of years. By that time, there's a new group of people who are susceptible to it, because if you survive smallpox, you're going to have immunity to it. There's good evidence for, Japan is an interesting case. I can't remember the exact year that smallpox came in, so it spread from the Asian mainland, but it's thought that previously the population would have been too small for it to remain circulating, become endemic. Now, I do mention this is a dual-edged sword, because societies that do have these endemic diseases circulating around, the survivors have immunity, but the population as a whole gets partial immunity over time through genetic adaptations to that, whereas the population that doesn't have it doesn't have any immunity at all. We'll see this in a huge way when we look at people coming from Europe and Africa to the Americas and bringing diseases to which the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas had no resistance to, and hence huge mortality after that. And my final slide is going to just show expansion of agriculture, again, out of these initial cores of independent agricultural innovation. And you can see the lines as people moved out of these areas into zones previously occupied by hunter-gatherers. That's important for demography, again, because the population of agriculturalists is going to be much larger, so this is really increasing the human population over most of the world over a long period of time. The lines here show some of these pathways. And at the beginning of the next lecture, I'm going to look at three of these in a little more detail, and you can see this on the map. I'll put it in red. In Europe, a spread of agriculture in the Neolithic Revolution up the Danube River and across the Mediterranean, eventually joining together, with hunter-gatherers being restricted to a few local areas. I'll talk about this as well in Africa with the Bantu people. That's a language group, and we can see this in the spread of their language. They had adopted agriculture. That area in Africa with the dotted lines was a pretty early agricultural zone from Ethiopia all the way to West Africa. There's some scholars who think agriculture was independently developed here. Others think it came in from the Fertile Crescent area and then spread. But at any rate, if you go back, say 3,000 years ago, West Africa was agricultural, Southern Africa was not. It was hunter-gatherers. Some at that time just hunter-gatherers, and people started spreading south. With you can see those red lines eventually reaching the far tip of the continent. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the so-called Austronesian people. That's another language term who originated in Taiwan. They were the first people to master long distance navigation and sailing, and they spread into Southeast Asia. Just a few hunter gatherers remained, ultimately into the Pacific, into Polynesia, and reached New Zealand and across the Indian Ocean and reached Madagascar, which had not been inhabited until that time, only around 1,500 years ago. So that is the last lecture. The last slide for today's lecture. The next lecture will pick up the story. I'll talk about these three movements, and then I'll bring the story up to the early dawn of civilization, if you will, development of states, cities, literacy, and so on, and talk about the demographic consequences and factors behind it for this next big transformation or transition in the story of humankind. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it and will watch subsequent episodes.